This video has been kind of difficult figuring out how to talk about it because it's almost impossible to universally claim that a game looks good. Some people prefer artistic art styles and some people prefer realistic art styles, and both can look good and bad at the same time. So for this video, I decided to have it be more of a subjective suggestion of a video that you can take or leave and talk about games and settings that have an impact on frame rate, which is the other subject of the video, which is of course objective when it comes to saying that higher frame rates are better. But even then, it's not always the case because higher frame rates usually means that you are sacrificing graphical quality. But the question is, when is that the scenario? Well, I hope to answer that for you, so let's go ahead and get into the video.
God damn. Why are you fucking picking up now? What the fuck?
I don't know.
We've been close to, we've been like drawing. We've been on equal terms this entire time. And now you're just fucking picking it up. What the fuck? Okay.
To start out this video, let's talk about frame rate. Of course, we all know that frame rate is how many frames per second a video is being displayed in. Movies typically run at about 24 frames per second, and consoles usually run games at 30 or 60 frames per second, depending on the console generation and or the game. Now for PCs, the frame rate runs pretty much as high as your PC can handle, and many PC players are willing to dump a lot of money into a PC that can run games at higher and higher frame rates. Now, I know that many people, more so on the console side, will say that frame rate doesn't matter when you go higher than the refresh rate of your monitor. This is actually false because the game itself doesn't care about your monitor's refresh rate when it's taking into account how fast your mouse and keyboard inputs are being collected, which is usually at 1000 Hz. And of course, it goes without mentioning that having a monitor with a high refresh rate, such as 144 or 240 Hz, that'll make a huge difference because you are physically seeing more of those inputs. And yes, human eyes can see higher than 24 to 30 frames per second because the human eye does not see in frames per second, but it sees in a continuous manner. So to summarize, you should want to play at a higher frame rate, even if it is over the refresh rate of your monitor, because it will make a more responsive experience because you are seeing and feeling your inputs at a faster rate. So when is this important? Obviously, shooters benefit the most from higher frame rates because they require you to aim and are usually faster paced than something like an RPG. Usually when people reference fast-paced shooters, Doom is a good reference. But there are many more fast-paced shooters, especially in modern times, that require higher frame rates. Plus, it goes without saying that multiplayer shooters really do need higher frame rates. Most PC players understand this and will play multiplayer games with the lowest settings possible in order to achieve a higher frame rate. For instance, I have an RTX 2070 Super and an i7 7700K, and if I were to play Battlefield 4 with all of the settings on Ultra, I would easily get around 140 to 150 frames per second in intense situations. But I prefer to run the game with all settings on low with the exceptions of textures and models because not only do I get a higher frame rate, which is usually at 200, but enemy players are also easier to see. And this goes for most multiplayer games because as you turn the graphical settings up, the game adds more and more visual noise, distracting you from and even hiding enemy players. Okay, so I think I've made it pretty clear that when it comes to shooters, you always want to have the highest frame rate possible by turning down the settings, right? Well, no. Believe it or not, there are still shooters where I think that frame rate doesn't matter, and I think that the perfect example of that is Metro Exodus. This is a very demanding game that has a realistic art style and immersive gameplay and world building, which does put graphics at a higher priority because when you're trying to immerse yourself in a realistic looking game, it does slightly break your immersion to see a texture or effect that doesn't look quite as good as the rest of the game. So it's rather important to turn your graphics up. Trust me when I say that once you start modding the graphics and textures of Skyrim, you will never stop, because you'll have these beautiful textures that you modded into the game, and then you'll see a nasty vanilla texture with its poor resolution and no parallaxing. Now back to Metro. Another aspect that helps with the fact that lower frame rates are acceptable for that game is because it is a very slow-paced game with more of an emphasis on exploration and storytelling over combat. The same goes for games like Skyrim, The Witcher, Outer Worlds, Fallout, Kingdom Come, etc. Certainly all of these games have combat, but the combat speed and mechanics are all done in a way that lower frame rates aren't crippling like they would be in a faster paced game. Certainly higher frame rates will still help, but in my opinion in games like these, graphics are more important. And if you have a PC that can truly do both, then you're living your best life. You go girl. But I'm not done with graphics, because for the most part I've been talking about realistic graphics and their impact on frame rate. Typically people associate realistic looking games such as Kingdom Come, Metro, etc. as having good graphics because they look very realistic, but that's not always the case. I realize that I'm getting into a very subjective opinion territory, but a game doesn't have to look realistic to look good. Certainly, if you want your game to have realistic mechanics, world building, and immersion, then you should go with realistic graphics, as it helps with the player's immersion. But if not, then go for an artistic art style. You can get away with having less demanding and objectively worse graphical effects and settings, but still make it look really good. Pretty much all the games from New Blood Interactive are good examples of this. They not only look beautiful, but they still maintain high frame rates that the games demand since they are fast-paced shooters, but the graphics are still good enough to keep you engaged and looking at things, mostly because of the art style they offer. This isn't something that's easy to do, and especially when you are limiting yourself to an art style that was present in games that are over 20 years old. But even for modern games, balancing graphics and frame rate is very difficult to do properly. The modern Doom games have been praised for doing so, and that's mostly due to the Vulkan API that is very efficient and good for optimization. But it's not the API that's doing the heavy lifting, but the engine itself and the great optimization work that the developers have done, which is something that I understand is very difficult to do, are the main contributors to such good optimization. When I play a game such as Outer Worlds, it makes no sense to me that the game is as demanding as it is. It's a good looking game, but not good enough to have such a low frame rate. This is mostly due to the poor optimization, but even then, it's a game that doesn't require high frame rates due to its slower paced gameplay, and the story and character writing is good enough to carry the game by itself, but it would be nice to have better optimization.
We can skip the entire colony ship into the Rings of Terra too.
Experimental methods for killing noxious life forms are not covered under this unit's limited liability agreement.
Well said, whatever you are.
In a perfect world, every game would have the visual quality of something like Kingdom Come or Metro, but have the performance of something like Dusk. But that's not realistic. Some games are famous, and to a degree infamous, for pushing the hardware of their time for the reason of having the best graphics in the world, but also for future-proofing their games. But it's cool to imagine a time in the future when hardware can run a game like this with ease, and it's even cooler imagining what the extremely demanding games of the future will look like. But for the time being, it's pretty easy to say that for fast-paced shooters and multiplayer games, you'll benefit from lowering your settings and having a more responsive game due to the higher frame rates. But if you're playing a slower-paced game, then go ahead and crank those graphics up as far as you can while still having a reasonable frame rate for the reason of immersion. But even then, it still comes down to personal preference. Some people are perfectly fine with playing something like The Witcher with their settings turned down because they want a higher frame rate, and that's perfectly okay. I can't tell you what to do and what you will like the most, but I can make suggestions, and that's what I'm hoping you get from this video. So yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say. I hope that you enjoyed the video and you learned something from it. What are your opinions? Do you prefer for all of your games to have the highest frame rate possible? Or do you like to mix and match depending on what type of game it is? Or do you just want everything to look really good no matter what the frame rate is? Let me know in the comments below. And until the next video, have a good one.